Welcome readers. We would like to introduce the story Discount Dan by Shadow Alley Press. All Dan wants is to find a way home. He'd settle for a beer, a bite to eat, and a place to sleep off his hangover. But, in an endless, ever-changing dungeon cobbled together from twisted carnivals, abandoned shopping malls, janky laundromats, and condemned insane asylums, getting a bit of shut-eye is harder than it sounds. Dan has accidentally slipped into the backrooms, a bizarro, extra-dimensional Alice in Wonderland world, overrun with horrific nightmare creatures known as the Dwellers. No one ever gets out. Hell, forget about leaving. If Dan wants to survive the week, he's going to need to harness the strange game-like magic of the backrooms, make some very sketchy allies, and carve out a little safe haven to call his own. And he's going to need to do it fast because Dan is being hunted. The flayed monarch of the 999th floor has marked him for death, and no one walks away from the skinless court with their hide intact. What to expect? No harem. Lead up in hard stats. There's an artifact-based deck builder system. Lots of violence. Lots of loot. Lots of skills and titles. Gratuitous and creative swearing, which might be a turn-off to some. There is a dog who was made entirely out of croc shoe material. He has googly eyes. This detail is non-negotiable. Loosely set in the backrooms for those who might know what that is, but it won't affect your enjoyment of the story if you don't know what that is. One reviewer summarized it pretty well. It's like an adult version of Infinity Train, but one that developed with Dungeon Crawler Carl. It's just beautiful. Chapter 1. I was going to die. At least, that's what the floating screen told me. The prognosis for your long-term survival is vanishingly slim, the message read in bold, blocky letters. The words were scrawled across a semi-transparent yellow window, which looked like one of those 8-bit Nintendo game notifications from the late 80s. I suggest you come to terms with this reality and prepare yourself accordingly. If you happen to be a person of religious conviction, now would be an appropriate time to make amends with your preferred deity. My eyes skipped frantically from word to word as I reread the prompt for the third time. What in the absolute fuck is going on here? A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and I momentarily pulled my gaze away from the prompt and looked down at the ground. The ghostly yellow screen remained frozen in the air. I was in a wide hallway with short gray carpet, the kind they use in hotels and office buildings, and walls covered from floor to ceiling in stained yellow wallpaper, peeling in places and covered with water spots in others. Directly behind me was a dead-end hallway with a blazing red exit sign, but no door. Ahead was an open, empty conference room with high ceilings that could have belonged inside any of 1,000 run-down hotels across America. The walls were plastered with more of the nondescript yellow wallpaper, and white columns rose to a drab white tiled ceiling dotted with recessed fluorescent lights. Those lights flickered sporadically, casting pools of sterile illumination in oceans of darkness across the carpeted floor and turns. There was no furniture in the room beyond. No end tables or cheap wing-backed chairs. No reception desk or receiving area. Just an enormous, abandoned cavern of gray carpet and wallpaper, which reminded me of a yawning mouth. Hall was branched off from the vacant conference room, snaking out of view. This couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. None of this made any sense. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out where I was, how I'd gotten here, or what in the name of sweet baby Jesus was happening to me. Maybe I was going crazy. Or maybe I died, and this was my own, personal version of hell. That was the most plausible option, all things considered. The last thing I remembered was from the night before. I'd been at the bachelor party to end all bachelor parties with the rest of the guys from the general contracting crew. There had been a stripper dressed as a clown for reasons I couldn't quite recall. Although my well-known hatred of clowns probably had something to do with it. Also, fireworks. Well, maybe not fireworks per se, so much as sticks of tenorite and a wee little bit of dynamite, which our buddy Jake had procured from a demo site in Dayton. Cow tipping had definitely been involved at one point. I vividly recalled cannonballing off my buddy's axe roof into an oversized kiddie pool filled with an unholy amalgamation of Natty Ice, Bud Light, Corona, and whatever else the rest of the crew had lying around. Pretty sure Dave had dumped 2 or 3 boxes of Francia red wine into the unspeakable alcohol concoction. That probably explained why it felt like I'd slept in a churning cement mixer filled with boulders and broken beer bottles. Leaping into kiddie pools full of booze was a young man's game, and I wasn't as young as I used to be. Not old exactly, but even at 36, I found I didn't bounce back quite the way I had at 26. Getting absolutely shit-faced also explained the raging hangover and the dull ache radiating through my skull. But none of that gave me any insight whatsoever into where I was, how I'd gotten here, or what in heaven above was happening. There was just a blank hole, big enough to drive an Abrams tank through, between the party and waking up in this barren stretch of industrial hallway. One minute I was laughing with Jake and Zach, telling old war stories about our time in the sandbox together, and the next I was peeling my ass off the gray carpet with the glare of harsh fluorescence stabbing into my eyeballs like an ice pick. Guttural, inhuman roars and the sharp clang of steel clashing against steel drifted from a corridor just out of sight. This place might have appeared barren, but it wasn't empty. Something was in here with me. Something dangerous. Which probably accounted for the ominous warning, tattooed on the earth itself. The sounds of battle were getting progressively closer by the second. Feeling the cold edge of panic creep into my chest, I turned my gaze back to the yellow screen and reread the message once more, this time from the beginning. Warning. Temporal boundary displacement breach. As standing chair of the Variant Research Division, it is my responsibility to inform you that due to an unstable temporal anomaly, and circumstances outside of VRD control, you have accidentally experienced a temporal displacement event, TDE, sometimes referred to as an eclipsing. Fortunately, you survived the event and have not been integrated into the progenitor engine or reduced to meat slurry by the influx processing and randomization system. Unfortunately, the prognosis for your long-term survival is vanishingly slim. I suggest you come to terms with this reality and prepare yourself accordingly. If you happen to be a person of religious conviction, now would be an appropriate time to make amends with your preferred deity. The researcher. Yeah. None of that was even remotely helpful. I'd never heard of the Variant Research Division, and I couldn't even begin to wrap my mind around what a temporal displacement event was. To me, the whole message was just a bunch of bullshit that sounded more or less like corporate speak for go fuck yourself. I squinted, examining the box itself a little more closely. I'd been so panicked and shocked by the message that I'd failed to notice there was a tiny X in the top right corner of the notification. I let my gaze linger on it for a beat, and when I mentally clicked the button, the window blinked away. Gone in an instant as though it had never been there at all. A thunderous boom rattled the floor, sending fine dust motes spinning and dancing overhead. A moment later I heard an odd mewling noise followed in short order by the dull thump of footsteps and the whoomph of an explosion. Rolling tongues of flame blazed into view from a connecting corridor before quickly dissipating. Every instinct screamed at me to turn tail and haul ass in the opposition direction, but there was nowhere for me to go. I was trapped in a hallway with no exit and the only way out was through the conference room ahead. I idly considered trying to climb up through the ceiling panels, but instantly knew that wasn't an option. They were 12 feet up, easy. Even in my prime I couldn't have made that leap. I turned back toward the conference room just in time to see 2 figures barrel into view from a hallway off to the left. The first was human. The second was not. In a blaze of furious movement, a lanky man in a duster bolted forward and lashed out with a ridiculously oversized sword, slamming the weapon into what could only be called a monster. There was no other description that fit. Though writhing crimson ball of nightmare fuel came close. The sword blow battered the horror diagonally across the cavernous space like a baseline drive, and it collided with one of the square columns on the far side of the room. The impact violently shook the floor and cracked the pillar in two. More plaster particles swirled in the harsh blue-white light. The attack would have snapped me in two, but it hardly seemed to faze the creature. It pulled itself from the ground with ease. Although the monster was 80 feet away, I finally got my first good look at the thing. Problem was, even with it standing in clear view, my brain couldn't quite comprehend what exactly I was seeing. It was a bit like looking at one of those McEscher paintings where the perspective is all wrong and none of the lines come together the way they ought to. And the longer I stared, trying to puzzle it out, the more it hurt my eyes. The eldritch horror was 8 feet tall and vaguely man-shaped, though it wasn't human even in the most liberal sense of the word. An extra pair of arms jutted out from its muscled torso, and its whole body was bloody red and sinewy as if the creature had been crudely filleted alive. Its lower half was a mess of segmented legs protruding out from a writhing centipede body. A cruel obsidian mask covered its face and crown of jagged black spikes hung suspended above its head. A cloak of thrashing scarlet tentacles trailed down its back, reaching all the way to the carpet. Those tentacles were covered in oozing sores and glaring eyes. Embedded in the center of the monster's bloody chest cavity was a gleaming multifaceted gem with golden numbers engraved on its various faces. Encircling the glittering stone were 6 glowing green sigils that looked like they'd been cribbed from the Necronomicon. In one hand, the monster held a curved koppish crafted from yellowed bone, and in the other it wielded a whip made entirely of teeth and spinal vertebrae. Those weapons radiated a dark, almost malevolent aura that left me both nauseous and scared shitless. I looked down, evaluating what I had to defend myself with. I was in trouble. A lot of trouble. Turned out, drunk me had made some interesting fashion choices the night before. Choices that I was deeply regretting right now. Slung around my shoulders and trailing down to my thighs was a knockoff red and gold, Baroque Versace bathrobe. It was a hideous assault on taste and sensibility, and it actively made me despair for the future of humanity. I had never hated something so profoundly, or so quickly. Where it had come from or why on God's green earth I was wearing it were mysteries that beggared the imagination. I had on a wife beater beneath the robe and a pair of cut-off jean shorts, better known in trailer parks the world over as Daisy Dukes or jorts, that were so short and so tight they looked like faded blue denim spray painted onto my nutsack. Instead of tennis shoes or flip-flops, drunk me had opted for my clunky work boots, which were missing the laces. Then, to complete the look, I'd apparently decided to don my tool belt, which connected to a pair of leather suspenders. Although I didn't have a mirror, I knew exactly how I must have looked. Like a strung-out hobo who'd managed to raid both a Home Depot and an upscale department store during a city-wide blackout. Of all the terrible life choices I'd made last night, however, grabbing my work belt had been the best of the lot. I reached down and slid free my 19 ounces ripclaw hammer. The shaft was hickory, the head worn from years of hard use. Its familiar weight was a comfort in my clammy hand, even though I doubted it would do much good against the walking nightmare. Certainly not as much good as a Glock with a full mag. Not that a Glock would serve me much better. Even though I'd spent 8 years in the Marine Corps and done a couple pumps overseas to combat zones scattered across the Middle East, I'd served as a motor T driver. I'd spent most of my time behind the wheel of a troop carrier, pounding rippets and chain-smoking cigarettes, not kicking indoors or raiding insurgent stash houses. And that was the better part of 10 years and 30 pounds ago. Other than the occasional hunting trip with the boys, I hadn't picked up a firearm in ages. Besides, even if I were an expert shot and in peak physical condition, a handful of 9mm rounds weren't gonna do much against that thing. Hell, I was pretty sure a .50 cal and an anti-tank javelin missile wouldn't do much against that thing. If it wanted me dead, I wouldn't last more than a handful of seconds before it gutted me like a trout. My hand tightened around the handle anyway. Fuck it. If I was going to die, at least I'd go down swinging. But maybe it wouldn't come to that. The big ol' scary son of a bitch didn't seem to be interested in me. Not yet, anyway. Its attention was entirely fixed on the lone figure swaggering through the conference room like an Old West gunslinger getting ready for a showdown at high noon. Chapter 2. The gunslinger wore a beat-to-shit leather duster and a silver breastplate crisscrossed with dual bandoliers studded with shotgun shells. Looped around his neck was a frayed gray noose and dangling from the end of the rope was a small Winnie the Pooh plushie, which was battered and bloody. The man's hair was short and brown with a spattering of gray at the temples, but his eyes were hidden behind a pair of steampunk goggles and the lower portion of his face was obscured by a black bandana. The barrel of a gilded blunderbuss protruded over one shoulder, and he had a leather holster slung low around his hips, holding an old-timey revolver. He carried neither firearm, though. Instead, he wielded an oversized foam anime sword, the blade leaning against a spiked pauldron strapped on over the top of the duster. And I don't mean it looked like an anime sword. This was an actual foam anime sword, like one of the props cosplayers would bring to Comic-Con, except he carried it with deadly intent. The way the demon's face kept drifting toward the weapon made me think it was wary of the foam blade. The gunslinger's other hand was empty, but he wore a heavy golden glove that reminded me of a medieval version of the Infinity Gauntlet, except, and this was the real kicker, instead of infinity stones, there were dice affixed to the knuckles. A red D4 on the pinky, a green D6 on the ring finger, a blue D8 on the middle finger, and a golden D10 on the index finger. Arcs of electric blue lightning sprinted over the surface of the gunslinger's metallic hand, and it crackled with power just waiting to be unleashed. The man paused briefly as he moved past the hallway where I was bravely cowering. His eyes flicked toward me, lingering for a long moment. It felt like he was weighing me, judging me. The weight of his gaze, of his sheer presence, seemed to press down on me like a hand. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was raspy and rough, as though he'd forgotten how to speak and was trying it out for the first time in ages. "Dan," I answered, as much of a question as it was a statement. "Dan Woodridge. From Cincinnati," I added after a beat. The gunslinger grunted and nodded, as though I'd imparted some profound truth, then dipped his fingers into a pouch at his belt. He pulled out a silver medal token and casually flipped it to me with his thumb. I snagged it from the air, holding it tight like a drowning man clinging to a life preserver. "Dan Woodridge from Cincinnati," the gunslinger drawled in that same gruff tone. "If you value your life, stay back and use that. The flayed monarch will not hesitate to kill you." He paused, tense. "Hopefully this will all be over before it comes to that." Without another word, he turned away and refocused on the demon, who was still some 60 feet or so away. The terrible pressure of the gunslinger's gaze vanished and suddenly I could breathe again. I could think and move. I cautiously opened my hand and peered at the silver coin the man had gifted me, with a small ember of hope igniting in my chest. That hope deflated some when I saw what the coin actually was. Not a coin at all. Not some mystical amulet of great power. It was a Pog slammer. Like Pogs, the circular, cardboard tokens that had been all the rage in the late '90s. I'd played Pogs as a kid and I remembered having a slammer not so different from the one in my hand. On one side was a cheesy, holographic snake wrapped around a grinning skull, and on the other was a picture of a birdcage containing a bulbous-headed canary with the words "Unflippable Sanctum" engraved around the outer edge. I ran a thumb over the snake and skull, then traced it around the raised lettering. A faint thrum of power seeped off the slammer, sending a jolt of energy racing along my fingertips and up through my arm. A much smaller version of the yellow, 8-bit pop-up appeared above the coin. Super Slammer of Shielding. Rare artifact. Type, reusable, daily. Uses, 2 o'clock minutes remaining. Time until reset, 12 hours, 13 minutes. The Super Slammer of Shielding is a rare magical artifact that summons a mostly impenetrable dome of arcane power, capable of protecting all those within its confines from physical, arcane, and elemental attacks. The Super Slammer of Shielding can be used for 2 minutes per day, though those minutes and seconds do not need to be consecutive. The timer resets at exactly 12 a.m. Newfoundland Standard Time (NST). Why Newfoundland Standard Time? Because fuck you, that's why. To activate the spell, throw the slammer against the floor and recite the forbidden arcane incantation, "Let's Pog." To deactivate the spell, simply pick the slammer up and utter the sage words of old, "That's so '90s. This is a joke, right? It has to be a joke." Slammer still gripped tightly in my hand, I shot a look at the gunslinger, who had made his way to the center of the conference room, partially positioning himself between me and the blister-red, four-armed monstrosity. "I just want out," the gunslinger said, sounding exhausted to his bones. He extended his gauntlet, palm up in expectation. All I need is one more seal. Just the one. Give it to me and I'll fuck right off. I don't want to kill you. I don't even want to fight you. Just give me what I want, and you can go back to the pit on the 999th floor and do whatever the hell it is you like to do. Eat kittens. Skin puppies. Watch endless reruns of My Little Pony. I do not give a single shit. It's none of my concern. The flayed monarch cocked its head to the side as though carefully considering the words. It was impossible to read its face beneath the obsidian mask, but to me it looked almost intrigued. Perhaps there is a deal to be struck. The monarch's reply sounded like a legion of off-key voices all speaking at once, each slightly out of sync with the others. The researcher has stifled me for too long, the creature continued. The bounds of my kingdom chafe. You want the stone. I want the gauntlet. We both want to leave. To be free. He extended a long talon hand. But we shall never be free of each other until we are free from this place. Let us work together, yes? The gunslinger snorted. Yeah, I'm sure the researcher would just love that. The monarch growled, the rumble of an angry lion resonating from deep inside its chest. The researcher is an old fool, and his purpose and function were obsolete 1,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago. He is a relic of the past, not a reflection of the glorious future that we could forge together. The creature's legs clicked softly as it edged forward. That's plenty close enough, the gunslinger said, raising the anime sword from his shoulder. One more step and I'll cleave you in two. I listened to them go back and forth, holding my breath and not moving so much as a pinky. I was basically following Jurassic Park rules at this point. I doubted the demon had the same ocular weakness as a T-Rex, but it was worth a shot. Surely, there's no need for that, the monster crooned at the gunslinger. Violence doesn't serve our purposes. Think about it, Marcus. You and I both know his power is already stretched thin. So very thin. He might be a god in this place, but not even a god could stop us if we put aside our petty squabbles. I'm not sure I'd call them petty, the man replied. You killed Lisa and cut off my hand. He raised the metal gauntlet, and added one of my eyes to your collection. He gestured at the tentacle cloak. Small things when weighed against the value of freedom, the monarch said as though the litany of offenses were water under the bridge. Let me put this plain, Marcus growled. I would rather drown on floor 207 in a pool of dog vomit than work with you. Although I couldn't see the monarch's face, I could almost hear it grin behind the obsidian faceplate. Perhaps I will grant you your wish before leaving this place. Then, in the space of an eye blink, the demon shot forward like a bullet, its blade blurring through the air. Kapish met sword and a clap of thunder and a reverberating clang that sounded for all the world like metal. Golden sparks and sizzling arcs of red electricity spit upward. The monstrous force of the two weapons unleashed a ripple of power that exploded outward, snapping another of the nearby columns in two. The energy blast also hit me square in the chest like an invisible mule kick, effortlessly hurling me back down the hallway. I landed on the ground with a thud and fought to pull in even a single gulp of air. My already aching ribs were on fire now, and it felt like something might have broken inside my chest. Part of me just wanted to lie there and die quietly, but 10,000 years of primal survival instinct wouldn't allow me to give up quite so easy. Followed by a surge of adrenaline, I regained my feet and retreated further down the hall. Unfortunately, I didn't have far to go, and now I was trapped between a rock and a pair of unspeakably powerful demigods working out years' worth of repressed anger issues. If I didn't do something, I was going to die here. I still had the slammer in my hand, and though it seemed asinine, I wasn't exactly spoiled for choices. I spiked it against the carpet like a football and belted out the words, "Let's pog." Chapter 3. Obviously, I felt like a complete jackass, but when the world starts operating on bullshit Alice in Wonderland logic, I figured the best thing to do was just roll with it, I guess. Or, in this case, throw it onto the ground and scream out a nonsensical 90s catchphrase. As the slammer hit, a burst of warm energy bubbled outward in a ring. Emblazed on the ground was a golden circle with a glimmering image of the snake and skull temporarily branded into the carpet. Rising up around me was a golden birdcage, built from shimmering bars of light. A 2-minute timer appeared in the corner of my eye, ticking steadily down toward 0. Hesitantly, I crept up to the edge of the circle and grabbed at one of the bars. My hand passed right through as though it were an illusion. A trick of smoke and mirrors. I thought I felt the slightest tickle of electrical current pass through my palm, but it was so faint it could have been my overworked imagination. Meanwhile, the battle between the two titans raged unabated. The flayed monarch descended upon the gunslinger with a blood-curdling screech, which brought the hairs on the back of my neck standing to attention. Its forearms were a blur of manic motion, the bone coppish and spinal whip lashing out in a deadly dance. Each time the whip snapped, a burst of bloody red light flashed through the conference room and huge fissures appeared along the walls. Hurricane force wind howled into the hallway, but instead of bowling me over, it hit the golden birdcage and fizzled without ever even ruffling my hair. I looked down at the slammer. Well, holy shit. That was a pretty good trick after all. The gunslinger effortlessly avoided each whip strike, ducking, sidestepping, even momentarily blinking in and out of existence while he advanced, undeterred. The foam blade in his hands was a whirlwind and, as he moved, ghostly blue flames formed along the edge of the weapon. The monarch turned every strike and parried every thrust, but he wasn't launching a counter-asso. It was all the demon could do to keep the gunslinger at bay. Of the two, it was clear the human warrior had a small edge in melee combat. The gunslinger finted left and lashed out with a quick jab, then darted at right and brought the sword screaming down in a vicious arc aimed at the monarch's exposed neck. The demon couldn't get its blade up in time, but as the weapon struck, the creature turned into a fine red mist and drifted away at the last moment. The horror reformed on the opposite side of the conference room, completely unscathed by the brutal attack. Now that the monarch had some breathing room, it raised a hand and muttered a grating incantation that made my ears bleed. Literally. I reached up with a trembling hand and wiped away a streak of red trickling down my cheek. The golden dome was powerful, but clearly it had limitations. Meanwhile, 100 crimson spears and swords appeared in the air above the demon's jagged black crown. The monarch casually flicked its wrist forward, and the conjured arsenal lurched toward the gunslinger like an artillery barrage. The gunslinger attempted to blink out of existence, but a fleshy red tentacle, covered in a multitude of eyeballs, erupted from a nearby column, wrapping around one of his legs, rooting him to the spot. He thrust his golden gauntlet out and a blazing azure dome appeared around him, insulating him from the encroaching army of floating weapons before they could hack him to pieces. The monarch's conjured weapons furiously slashed at the energy barrier, leaving thin cracks in their wake, but they couldn't break through. The gunslinger paid them no mind. Instead, he reached out, and a small black void flashed into existence, just long enough for the time-beaten warrior to pluck something free. He flung whatever he'd retrieved onto the ground outside the bounds of the blue dome. A handful of plastic green army men hit the carpet, then immediately swelled in size. In the space of seconds, 24 hulking green warriors appeared, though their proportions were all wrong. Arms twisted. Legs bent at odd angles. Their faces contorted masks of tortured wax. Unrealistically posed army men, reporting for duty. One of the hulking figurines barked. Defensive position B14. The gunslinger bellowed. Aye, sir. The rest of the troops cried in gruff unison, before launching into action. Without missing a beat, they formed a neat wall surrounding the exterior of the dome and began retaliating against the monarch's flying cloud of living weapons. Some fought with bayonets that burned with eldritch green witchfire. Others used backpack flamethrowers to unleash columns of brilliant orange and red fire, burning the bloody weapons from the air. The gunslinger used the distraction to hack through the tentacle with his sword. The blade severed the grasping limb in a few quick chops, then the dome vanished as the gunslinger blinked across the room and hurled a javelin of blue lightning from his gauntlet. The monarch was ready. The demon tossed out a plastic red Easter egg, which intercepted the incoming bolt of power. There was a brief flash and the spell disappeared before it ever landed. The two collided back into each other in a clash of limbs, spells, and blades as army men and disembodied weapons fought a merciless, pitched battle. A dark cloud formed overhead, and droplets of blood rained down, scorching the carpet, searing the yellow wallpaper, and burning through pretty much anything it touched. Several oversized plastic men got caught in the deluge and were shortly reduced to piles of melted wax, which left an acrid stink lingering in my nose. The scarlet rain didn't do anything to the gunslinger, though. It rolled right off him like water off a duck's back, pooling in acidic puddles by his feet. The two continued to fight with rabid fury, trading blow for blow, but neither seemed to be able to get the upper hand. Even when it seemed like one might prevail, the other always had some new spell or magical trinket ready to nullify the effects. The ground shook and a forest of deadly, rebar spikes erupted from the carpet. The gunslinger avoided the attack entirely by leaping upward, then he sprinted across the air itself with some unseen ability. A barrage of sharpened icicles fell from the churning clouds, only to be burned away by an inferno blaze of unquenchable black flame. All the while, the timer ticked away in the corner of my eye, drawing closer to 0. 57 seconds left to go on the arcane shield protecting me. The monarch manifested a plain bicycle playing card, a 10 of diamonds, and proceeded to pluck the diamonds from the face of the card and hurl them at the gunslinger as they grew to the size of frisbees. But the weather-beaten warrior was ready for that, turning them away with a jack of clubs that unfurled and grew into a shield that absorbed the attacks before disintegrating to ash. The back-and-forth volley was like watching a world-class round of tennis, except they were trading earth-shattering spells and physical blows powerful enough to rip the limbs from my body. 44 seconds left. The gunslinger lifted a hand and let loose a flare of blinding light from his palm, so bright it seared a purple afterimage into my retinas. When the burst of illumination finally vanished, I watched as he blinked through space and time once more, appearing behind the monarch with his sword already descending in an arc that would decapitate the monstrous creature if it landed. But the monarch anticipated the attack and spun like a top, narrowly avoiding the sword strike. In one quick motion, the monster turned and drove its curved koppish directly into the gunslinger's guts. The weapon sliced cleanly through the warrior's armor like a scalpel, then punched out through the back, the blade covered in slick scarlet. The gunslinger glanced down at the sword with a look of dumb surprise etched into the lines of his weathered face. His hands groped at the koppish, but before he could even attempt to pull it out, eye-covered tentacles exploded from the walls and floors. One set wrapped around the gunslinger's legs, and another wrapped around his shoulders. The tentacles yanked, and the man came apart at the middle, strands of bloody gore and gray intestine dangling out. Then, with an almost casual disdain, the tentacles flicked the warrior away like a piece of garbage. The man's brutalized body landed with a wet thump not far from the mouth of the corridor I was hiding in. I'd seen some shit while overseas, but that. Never anything like that. It was a death blow, beyond recovery. For anyone other than the gunslinger. The warrior had been eviscerated, his steampunk goggles were smashed and hanging down around his neck, and there was blood absolutely everywhere. Somehow, though, he was still alive. Although he probably wouldn't be for long. With painful slowness, the man reached trembling fingers toward the Winnie the Pooh plushie strung around his neck. Whatever he was going to do, he wasn't doing it fast enough. He turned and glanced at me, his singular gray-blue eyes silently pleading for help. But what the hell could I do? How could I possibly stop the demon, where he had failed? The gunslinger had magic. Weapons. A platoon of green plastic army men. I had a hammer and a Versace bathrobe. As though finally realizing just how boned he was, the gunslinger finally tore his gaze away from me and looked at the demonic monstrosity languidly moving toward him, as inevitable as death itself. The monarch seemed to be taking its time. Almost savoring the moment. Shit, shit, shit. This was bad. Really bad. I knew next to nothing about these two titans, but the guy lying on the floor was human and had gone out of his way to help me, even when he didn't have to. As far as I was concerned, that made him the good guy. That and the fact that he didn't have centipede legs or a tentacle eyeball cloak. 30 seconds left on my shield. Shit. What am I doing? Something dumb, that's what. something that would probably get me killed. I took a deep breath, already kicking myself for being a moron. I squatted down and picked up the slammer, muttering "That's so single quote 90s, under my breath. The golden birdcage blinked away, leaving me with just over 20 seconds of juice left in the coin. Then, before I could overthink things, I took off at a sprint, slammer in one hand, hammer in the other. The demonic creature was closing in on the badly wounded warrior. If the rough plan I had kicking around inside my skull was going to work, I needed to act now. I muttered a quiet prayer, planted my feet, and hurled the metal token. It arced gracefully through the air, holographic skull glittering majestically as it flipped and toppled. It landed a foot away from the battered and broken gunslinger, and as it did, I yelled the stupid incantation, "Let's pog." The golden birdcage blazed to life and the timer popped up on the edges of my vision, trickling down from 24 seconds. 24 seconds wasn't much, but it was the best I could do. The only thing I could do. The gunslinger didn't waste the opportunity. He wrapped a trembling, blood-stained hand around the Winnie the Pooh plushie, suspended from the gray noose, and muttered something under his breath. The stuffed animal began to burn with an eerie red light. A crimson slash appeared across Pooh's stuffed belly, the two halves of the gunslinger miraculously pulled themselves together, and his skin and flesh began to mend itself. I'd bought him a few precious seconds, but the healing process wasn't going quite as quickly as I'd hoped, and the monarch had turned away from the gunslinger and toward me. There was curiosity in the way the creature cocked its head, almost as though it were noticing my existence for the first time. The demon looked at me the way someone might look at an ant scuttling across a kitchen counter. "You should not have done that," it buzzed, anger undercutting the inhuman words. "Yeah, tell me something I haven't heard my whole life," I replied. Then, because I was already elbow-deep in a shit sandwich that was almost certainly going to kill me, I made another bad choice. "Now how's about you go fuck yourself?" I took another step and hurled the hammer with every ounce of strength I could muster. The tool, meant to drive in nails, not fight otherworldly demonic beings, somersaulted, end over end, and smashed into the monarch's obsidian face. The demon didn't even try to move or dodge, which was a little insulting. The tool hit with a metallic clatter then dropped harmlessly to the gray carpet without doing any damage at all. Hell, it didn't even manage to scratch the paint on the monarch's faceplate. I had no doubt the creature could have cleaved me in two or ripped the head from my shoulders without breaking a sweat. Apparently, I didn't warrant even that much effort. The monarch simply lifted one hand and a colossal spiritual weight slammed down on me like a bulldozer. My knees buckled and I hit the floor without offering an ounce of resistance. The pressure squeezed the air from my lungs, then kept right on squeezing until I thought my lungs were going to pop. Blackness crept in on the edges of my vision and tremendous pressure built around my eyes. My heart labored, and I could feel the bones in my chest, arms, and legs grind and break. Magma flowed through my veins and every breath felt like drowning. Perfect. Not only was I going to die, I was going to die in the most excruciating way possible. My 9th grade math teacher had been right all along. But then, just as suddenly as the pain had started, it vanished. The pressure relented. I gasped, and though I knew irreparable damage had already been done, at least I could breathe again, which was one small mercy. The black receded and I fought to prop myself up on my elbows so I could see what had happened. The golden birdcage had dissipated, and the gunslinger now stood behind the monarch. He had driven his sword clean through the demon's chest. A jagged black tear, 2 feet long and a foot wide, had appeared inside the demon's torso. Through the void in the creature's chest, I could see a host of odd items. Weapons. Armor. Glimmering jewels. But other things too. Weird things. Things that made no more sense than life-sized green army men or eyeball tentacles. A plastic burger baron crown. A golden figurine of a werewolf. Some kind of trading card with a dragon on the front. One of those items, a battered bronze compass that had seen better days, tumbled free from the void and rolled across the floor. "Thank you for your help, Dan Woodridge from Cincinnati," the gunslinger said. "Should you survive, I will not forget it." Something sailed toward me, glinting in the fluorescence overhead. Whatever it was landed on my chest, which sent a fresh bolt of agony racing through my ribs. Before I could reply or giggle out an incoherent "You're welcome," there was a tremendous howl, and another brilliant flash filled the hallway. When the light finally faded and I could see again, the gunslinger and the monarch were gone. They left behind carnage, destruction, and a huge, charred spot where they'd been standing, but of the two battling demigods, there was no sign. It was great news, except for the fact that I was still, 100%, dying. I tried to move my legs and couldn't. My organs hurt and it felt like some giant, uncaring god had decided to squash me with an oversized boot. Then I got a glimpse of the thing on my chest. It was a slender glass bottle with a blue and black label that had the word Zima splashed across the front. I didn't remember Zima well. I'd only been a kid and well below the drinking age during its heyday, but I was pretty damn sure their slogan wasn't the #1 bone-healing juice in the market. Guaranteed to make your insides feel like glim-flam. Hovering above the bottle was a small square icon, a black question mark on a mustard-yellow background. When I examined it closely, a prompt appeared, just like with the slammer. Zima, Greater Healing Elixir. Uncommon Elixir. Type, one-time use. Remember the deliciously refreshing taste of lightly carbonated Zima? Of course you do. Those were the good old days, am I right? You'll find the newest formula has all the same great flavor but will also regrow your spleen. Or your skin. Even missing limbs if you get them reattached quickly enough. Huzzah. So, kick back a cold one on us, and give your insides a new stab at life. After reading through the elixir description, I decided I was having a stroke on top of everything else, but at this point I also had zero shits to give. Everything hurt and nothing in the entire world made sense, except one thing. The gunslinger had given me this for a reason. This was my only chance at walking away from the confrontation. With numb, trembling fingers, I twisted off the cap, pressed the cool edge of the bottle to my lips, and chugged the bubbly and refreshing liquid. It burned a little going down, then landed in my stomach like a flash of liquid napalm. A renewed wave of agony rampaged through my body as my bones shifted beneath my skin, but then came absolute euphoria as the pain receded. The darkness wrapped around me, and this time I let it carry me away on a swift, delicious river of blissful endorphins. Chapter 4. I don't know how long I was out for, could have been 2 minutes or 10 hours. I didn't have a watch on, and there were no windows or other organic sources of light, so gauging the time was impossible. It was quiet, though. Other than the omnipresent buzz of the lights above, there wasn't a sound, which was unnerving in its own way. But at least I was alive. Hell, not just alive. I felt like $1,000,000. I sat up, stretched my arms, cracked my neck, then did a quick inventory, running my hands over my chest in search of wounds. The dull ache from my ribs was gone, there was no sign of the splitting headache from my night of drunken debauchery, and my muscles and joints hadn't felt this good in 10 years. Maybe ever. There was a black exclamation point blinking insistently in the corner of my eye. When I cautiously examined it, the symbol vanished and a new message from the researcher appeared. Even after 10,000 years, you humans still manage to surprise me from time to time. I had no expectations whatsoever that you would survive that encounter, much less serve as a tipping point in the battle. Yet here we are. Impressively done. Truly. As a result, you've earned several research achievements. Although this is quite irregular, I am going to prematurely assign a localized administrator to oversee your case. There are hundreds of different localized administrators, each with their own unique disposition, and you will be paired with one best suited for your personality profile. Your localized administrator is responsible for managing your virus upgrade interface, awarding research achievements, and allocating resources based on preset performance metrics and key research department objectives. It will serve as a guide during your time in the backrooms. Because of the anomalies associated with your case, be advised that you will not be able to fully integrate with the virus upgrade interface or redeem loot tokens until you exit the lobby and locate one of the progenitor monoliths on the lower floors. Should you manage to escape the lobby, I recommend seeking refuge in the nearest safe harbor, which is Howler's Hold. According to your current relative position (CRP), Howler's Hold can be located on Floor 7, Quadrant 12, Sector 3 for the next 3 days, 17 hours, 13 minutes, 28 seconds. Although this is likely the last you will ever hear from me, on behalf of the Variant Research Division, I wish you the best of luck. The Researcher. I read through the notice, and by the time I was done, I was even more confused than when I clicked on the exclamation point. Virus upgrade interface? Luke tokens? Progenitor monoliths? I was just hoping this localized administrator would be able to clear some of this shit up for me, because I'd never felt more lost in the sauce. When I dismissed the message from the Researcher, a whole slew of new notifications erupted, one right after another, scrolling across my vision like the opening crawl in a Star Wars movie. Research achievement unlocked. Premature administration. Don't worry, premature administration happens a lot to guys your age. I think there's probably a pill for that. Reward, lobby access to a localized administrator, iteration 1.135788092. Lucky you. Research achievement unlocked. My first artifact. You've successfully managed to find and activate a Backrooms artifact. Congratulations, you've accomplished something so insignificant that it's basically the Backrooms version of a participation trophy. Still, you managed to do it within 20 minutes of being here. How you even found an artifact in the lobby is, frankly, impressive. Pretty sure that's a new Backrooms record. Reward, 3x Copper Delver Loot Token, 1x Silver Delver Loot Token. Research achievement unlocked. Out of your league. You've attacked a monster more than 100 levels higher than you. If I had hands, I'd clap, then I'd use them to dig your grave. That's a ballsy move, even by my standards. No one in the recorded history of the Backrooms has ever done that and lived to tell the tale. Except you, apparently. Reward, 1,200 experience points, 1x Ruby Warlord Loot Token. Title, Out of Your League. Deal 10% additional damage to opponents more than 5 levels higher than you. Note, titles come with a wide range of passive benefits, which are always in effect, though you can only have 10 titles in effect at any given point. Level up. X3 Research achievement unlocked. Death Wish. You've survived an attack from a monster more than 100 levels higher than you. Do you have a death wish? Because this is how you die a very painful, but often quick, death. At least, it's quick if you're lucky. The fact that you somehow survived is mind-blowing and definitely worth a little something. Reward, 1,200 experience points, 1x Diamond Sentinel Loot Token. Title, Death Wish. All healing relics and artifacts become 5% more effective when your health drops below 15%. Level up. X1 Research achievement unlocked. Marked for death. Whether by poor luck or through a series of even poorer life choices, you've somehow managed to cross paths with the Flayed Monarch, easily one of the most powerful entities in all of the Backrooms. You're alive, but for how much longer is the real question. You've been marked for death, and all the aspirants who serve at the pleasure of the Skinless Court will try to murder you on sight. On the plus side, all factions who oppose the Skinless Court will be more favorable to you. You can always judge a man by the quality of his enemies. Oscar Wilde. Reward, 1x Gold Ambassador Loot Token. Title, Marked for Death. Deal 15% additional damage to all aspirants of the Skinless Court. Research achievement unlocked. Masochist in training. You suffered a single attack that reduced your health by more than 90%. I'd ask if you're okay, but there's no way that you're okay. I'm going to give you a reward, but I feel conflicted about it, since I don't want to positively reinforce this type of bad behavior. Reward, 4x Copper Medic. Loot Token, 1x Silver Medic. Loot Token. Research achievement unlocked. My first elixir. So, you've had a hard day at the office and suffered a catastrophic crippling blow that has left you tiptoeing on the line between life and death? Just another average Tuesday in Newfoundland. Crack the fridge and pull out a refreshing, medical-grade Zima, the #1 bone healing juice in the market. Guaranteed to make your insides feel like glim-flam. Reward: the delicious, refreshing, lightly carbonated taste of Zima is its own reward, am I right? I read through the list of increasingly bizarre notifications, which served as a disturbingly concise record of everything that had happened in the past couple hours. Using a magical pog slammer to summon an impenetrable dome of arcane energy? Check. Leaving the safety of said impenetrable dome to save some weird hobo with an anime sword by hurling my hammer at a skinless horror with the lower body of a centipede? Double check. Having my body pulverized and my bones crushed, only to be miraculously saved by chugging the Forerunner to White Claw. Yahtzee. I wasn't exactly sure what loot tokens were or how they worked, but I figured I could worry about that once I got clear of the lobby and found a way to the first floor. Problem was, I had no clue where I was, how big the lobby was, or how to leave. The utter lack of signage certainly didn't help the situation. With a grunt, I stood and took a slow look-see around, trying to get my bearings. There was no sign of the gunslinger or the monarch, but the devastation and carnage they left behind was still readily apparent. The two-man Armageddon had smashed through columns, split the walls open, and burned the carpet to cinders. Though, strangely, the damage appeared to be fading. Though maybe fading wasn't quite the right word. It was more like the damage was healing. Almost as if this place was actually a living organism, clothed with yellow wallpaper and tacky carpet instead of skin or scales. Curiosity got the better of me, and I headed over to examine a zigzagging crack in the plaster. As a general contractor, I'd hung more than my fair share of sheetrock and laid plenty of wallpaper. But as I ran my fingers over the jagged edge of the damage, I knew right away that this wasn't drywall, brick, concrete, gypsum board or any other construction material I'd ever worked with before. The material was wet, pliable, but also oddly fibrous. It felt more like a slab of beef than sheetrock, and when I pulled my fingers away, they were covered in slick, clear mucus. Holy shit. Maybe this place was healing itself. I suppressed a shudder and actively pushed away the dark thoughts cycling through my head. That didn't matter right now, I told myself. The only thing I needed to focus on at this moment was getting as far away from this particular location as fast as possible. I'd chucked the hammer at the head of an eldritch horror with godlike power and likely cost it a victory over a deadly rival. There was a good chance that Freak Show would come sniffing around sooner or later, looking for a little payback. And I didn't want to be here when it showed up. But I also didn't want to risk leaving anything valuable behind. I didn't know where I was or how long I'd be stuck in here, and I wouldn't survive long without supplies. And, if the legendary fight between the post-apocalyptic gunslinger and the skinless horror show had taught me anything, it was that every item could potentially be a valuable, life-saving tool. Even a 1990s pog slammer. First, I picked up the empty glass Zima bottle, which had rolled away from my hand after I'd passed out. The greater healing elixir description still populated when I closely examined the bottle's properties, but the elixir had been a one-time use item. Now it was just a bottle. I still shoved it into one of the outer pockets on my tool belt. I didn't have anything to drink from, and even if the bottle could no longer heal what ailed me, I could always fill it up with water on the off chance that I ran across a faucet or drinking fountain. Next, I made my way up the hall, rummaging through the debris and smoking rubble in search of anything else that might be useful. Most of the magical trinkets the two clashing deities had tossed around had been completely obliterated. The plastic green army men had shrunken back down to size, and whatever magic they'd once contained was now gone. There were shredded playing cards and pieces of tacky, plastic mall jewelry lying all over the place, but they were likewise destroyed beyond repair. A few things had survived, though. In the hallway, buried beneath a chunk of rubble, which looked like sheetrock and felt like fatty gristle, was a painted brass compass. The same compass that had fallen out of the monarch's chest after the gunslinger had run the creature through with his foam sword. At a glance, it looked like something you might find in a discount bin at a roadside antique store. Carefully, I poked it with the toe of my work boot, making sure it wouldn't explode or grow teeth and try to eat me. When nothing immediately terrible happened, I breathed a small sigh of relief, then gingerly picked it up off the floor, turning it over and over in my hands. It vibrated with a subtle thrum of energy and sent a gentle ripple of warmth through my arms and into my chest. This thing, whatever it was, had power with a capital P as with the bottle on the slammer. I examined the compass and a description box appeared, rendered in the same 8-bit graphics as the rest of the message boxes. This one was different, though. Restricted. Compass of the Catacomber. Mythic emblem. Whoops. Looks like you've stumbled upon an encrypted item. Because this emblem is rendered in archaic variant, language iteration 1.01, you cannot fully view its properties without a perception of 10, and you cannot equip it to your spatial core without a resonance of 15. To fix this issue, exit the lobby and visit the nearest progenitor monolith to finish fully integrating with the Backrooms virus. I dismissed the words and stowed the compass. Like everything else in this place, the error message left me with more questions than answers. There were 2 other items that had survived the destruction, my trusty 19 ounces claw hammer and the snake and skull slammer that the gunslinger had loaned to me. I fished the hammer off the floor, hand wrapping around the hickory handle, but faltered a second later when an identification icon briefly flared over the hammer's blunt metal head. I narrowed my eyes and glanced at the symbol with suspicion. 19 ounces von Hammer. Phobane. Rare artifact. Type, blunt weapon, personal significance. Enhanced victory through superior hammer power. Behold, the mighty 19 ounces straight claw hammer. This legendary tool is the perfect blend of elegance and functionality, ideal for smiting your foes or hanging a picture frame. Crafted by the finest blacksmiths of the Von Manufacturing Corporation, this versatile tool can pry open treasure chests or rip the arms off the faceless ghouls on the first floor. It's the perfect addition to any arsenal. But this simple-appearing tool is more than it seems. Used to strike a critical blow against the flayed monarch, this hammer has garnered additional significance, transforming it into a legend in the making. Effect 1. The bigger they are, through concentration, Phobane can be invested with mana, allowing it to grow or shrink in size. Regardless of apparent size, it will never seem to weigh more than 19 ounces for its bonded wielder. To activate this effect, the user must first equip a relic that enables mana usage. Effect slot, empty. Effect slot, empty. Effect slot, empty. I read through the description once, twice, then a third time. Unless I was somehow misreading things, my hammer was now a magical weapon. One that could grow and shrink by investing it with mana, though how I was supposed to do that, I wasn't quite sure. I focused on the tool in my hand, then shut my eyes and envisioned it swelling up to the size of a sledgehammer. Something stirred faintly inside my chest, a flicker of gentle heat, here then gone. When I cracked one eye, the hammer was still the same size it had always been. Feeling just a tiny bit of disappointment, I slid the hammer back into its customary loop on my belt. Still, I was curious. If the hammer had somehow gained magical attributes, what about my other gear? I pulled out my trusty demolition screwdriver and saw that it too had a muddy identification icon. Excited, I quickly pulled it up, but found that unlike the hammer, it was listed simply as a common artifact with a standard description. The only interesting thing of note was that, like the hammer, the screwdriver was listed as having personal significance. There were also 2 empty effect slots located at the bottom of the item description. A quick check revealed that all of my tools were like that. And not just them. My Red Wing work boots. The Nut Hugger jorts. Even the ass-ugly red and gold Versace bathrobe, which I'd literally never seen before. Each and every one was listed as a common artifact with personal significance. That didn't mean anything to me now, but both the researcher and the strange error message I'd received from the compass of the Catacomber had mentioned leaving the lobby to unlock additional features. I was betting that if I could find a way to get off this floor, some of this stuff might start making a little more sense. The last item I retrieved was the Snake and Skull Pog Slammer, which I'd tossed to the gunslinger during a moment of epic heroism. That or epic stupidity. I'd learned long ago that the line separating the two was often a mighty thin one, but since I'd survived the ordeal, I was going with heroism. I took a few extra seconds to pull up the description, double-checking that the artifact was still in working condition. I'd used the entirety of the artifact's 2 minutes of magical protection during the battle between the gunslinger and the monarch, so for the time being it was nothing more than a glorified paperweight. Or an actual pog slammer. At least, that's what I thought until I realized the cooldown timer had changed. Time until reset, 6 hours, 23 minutes. My memory was a little cloudy since I'd been on the verge of being murdered, but the last time I'd looked at the slammer, the time until reset had been around 12 hours. Which meant I'd been unconscious for just over 5 hours. I dismissed the pop-up and slid the slammer into my pocket, since it was now the most valuable item in my possession. Not only could it generate a protective shield for 2 minutes a day, but the cooldown feature also served as a rudimentary clock. A clock set to Newfoundland Standard Time, but a clock all the same. Now that I'd scavenged all the usable items from the scene of the battle, the only thing left to do was to get my ass moving and find a way to leave the lobby. Chapter 5. I spent the next several hours wandering through a seemingly endless series of twisting, turning, and interconnected corridors that didn't go anywhere or have a discernible purpose. It was a mind-numbingly dull labyrinth of gray carpet and yellow wallpaper, augmented by the occasional set of brown double doors that also went nowhere. I opened one set to find a solid wall with more wallpaper. Another led out into a short hallway, which ended after 20 feet. All of the hall was meandered without any real rhyme or reason, randomly connecting to wide conference halls, smaller meeting rooms, cozy alcoves, and more pointless corridors. Other than that, there was just nothing. No chairs. No tables. None of the inoffensive and utterly forgettable corporate art that usually decorated the walls in these kinds of places. There were also no signs, pool this way, fitness center on 4th floor, rooftop access, with one extremely notable exception. I ran across 6 different exit signs, all lit up in blazing red neon. Like the brown doors, they never went anywhere either. They were all positioned in dead-end hallways, just like the one I'd woken up in. I was starting to think they existed solely to mock any poor schmuck unlucky enough to get stuck in here. It was enough to drive a guy batshit. Especially a guy like me. This entire place was a contractor's worst nightmare. Nothing was up to code. There were no egress windows or smoke detectors. The constantly flickering lights pointed to botched wiring, and I hadn't seen a single electrical outlet. Right hand to the good Lord, the lack of proper ventilation would haunt me far more than the skinless monster with far too many limbs. Even more concerning, however, was the lack of drinking fountains or bathrooms. Having a place to take a dump was high on my list of priorities, but I could make do with a corner. But no water? Yeah, that was trouble. I could go a good long while without food, but water was one of those small amenities necessary for human survival. I had a day, maybe 2 at the outside, to figure out how to get out of the lobby before I passed out from dehydration and died in one of 1,000 unmarked corridors. And the truth was, I probably didn't even have that long. Although the monarch hadn't found me yet, there was something else in here with me. I wasn't sure what, exactly, and I never got a good look at it. It was always a flash of movement just on the edge of my peripheries or the scratch of claws rustling against carpet. It was the sense of eyes watching me from the dark, waiting ever so patiently for an opportune moment to strike. And whenever I sat down or even stopped moving for a little too long, I felt the noxious presence of the watchers draw nearer, closing in around me on every side. If I lay down for a bit of shut-eye, I was certain I wouldn't ever wake up again. Why these things hadn't eaten me while I was passed out for 5 hours, I couldn't say, but they were actively hunting me now. So, even though I was tired and thirsty, I kept moving. Kept searching for a way out. The lack of distinguishing features made it incredibly hard to navigate with any sort of confidence or certainty, but I was a former Marine and I had the benefit of my tool belt. The first thing I tried was the old Hansel and Gretel method. Using the fat-tipped Sharpie, I systematically left symbols at each intersection and juncture, noting which way I'd come from and which pathway I'd chosen, so I would know if I was doubling back or walking in circles. It was a solid plan. The backrooms was having none of it. This place had several countermeasures to make sure visitors couldn't game the system quite so easily. Turned out, the wallpaper was likely corrosive, almost like the digestive juices of some giant stomach. I figured that out when I took a short break, sat down, and leaned up against one of the walls. I'd been sitting for 10 minutes, tops, when I noticed a strange heat radiating through my stupid, ugly bathrobe. When I scrambled away, I found that the wall had eaten a dime-sized hole through the fabric. That same acidic quality also dissolved the Sharpie in a matter of minutes, which I learned after hitting a dead end, then backtracking to a large, circular conference room with a series of corridors branching off like the spokes of a wheel. It didn't take long to locate one of the trail markers I'd left behind, except the arrow I'd drawn was faded to a ghostly gray line, so faint it was nearly invisible. If I hadn't known any better, I would have said the mark had been exposed to the sun and the elements for months or even years. Curious, I milled around for a bit longer, watching as the arrow eventually faded completely and disappeared, leaving only unmarked yellow wallpaper behind. I wasn't out of options, though. Improvise, adapt, and overcome was the unofficial Marine Corps motto for a reason. It also doubled for contractors working on an unfamiliar job site. I stowed the Sharpie and pulled out my demolition screwdriver. In the past 8 years, I'd never once used the screwdriver to turn a screw. It had a blunt, flat head and I often used it like a chisel, that or as a spike to punch holes in walls or even pry boards apart. Instead of delicately scribbling arrows onto the walls, I started leaving behind deep, nasty puncture wounds to mark my route. I knew from experience that this place would heal those injuries over time. But based on what I'd observed after the battle between the gunslinger and the monarch, that could take hours instead of minutes. Not exactly an elegant solution, but it got the job done and that was all that mattered. Unfortunately, that plan had a few unexpected kinks as well. As with the Sharpie, the backrooms didn't appreciate my creative interior decoration. The lights blinked manically in annoyance after the first couple of stabs, and things got progressively worse from there. By the time I'd marked the 5th intersection, an angry tremor rattled through the floor, which made me sweat. Still, the holes stayed put, so I was hesitant to stop. When I punched the 6th hole, there was a long groan followed by the sound of thudding footfalls, rapidly closing in on me. The watcher was back, and it was closer than ever. That was enough to convince me to try something else. At the next intersection, instead of just punching a hole in the wall, I took out my utility knife and carved out a square of wallpaper, approximately 2 feet by 2 feet. The material was thin, flexible, and surprisingly durable. The texture also felt like human skin, which was extremely disturbing. But the back side of the wallpaper was plain white in color and didn't seem to have the same acidic qualities as the yellow front side. I used my Sharpie to sketch out a rough map of the area, and even after 10 minutes, the ink didn't fade. That made me think the wallpaper might have some other beneficial uses. It was easy to imagine crafting a pair of crude gloves, which would deal acid damage to anything I punched. But when I decided to push my luck and attempted to harvest the second section of wallpaper, the backrooms pushed back a bit more aggressively than before. A tremor as strong as an earthquake knocked me from my feet, and several of the lights blinked off entirely, plunging huge swaths of the corridor behind me into a thick shroud of oppressive darkness. When I fished out my flashlight and turned the beam toward the sudden patch of gloom, I found something waiting within. The Watcher. The spear of light bounced off a creature made of inky black shadows with a protruding pot belly, gangly arms, bulbous white eyes, stringy gray hair, and a too-wide mouth filled with a legion of jagged, needle-like teeth. It wore a tattered blue vest with a yellow smiley face pinned to the left breast. A tag briefly fluttered above the creature. Dweller 0.052C, Lobby Greeter Level 2. It tilted its head to one side, raised a spuddery hand, and waved at me in welcome. There wasn't anything even remotely friendly in the gesture, and it sent shivers racing along my spine. Especially when a second and third pair of bright, bulbous eyes blinked at me from the murk. The first greeter flinched away from the light, but the second I moved the beam away, the creature cautiously crept forward, right to the very edge of the darkness. At this point, I was reasonably certain the building itself was a living thing, but I still wasn't sure whether or not it was sentient. Had the lobby sent these things as an overt threat? Or was it possible that this was just some sort of automated response, like a body releasing white blood cells to deal with an invasive infection? I wasn't sure, but either way, it felt like a warning shot. Fuck around and find out. Me? I had no desire to find out, so I dismissed ideas of acid-dealing gloves and put as much distance between myself and the encroaching trio of nightmare lobby greeters as possible. Working under the theory that this place, whatever it was, in fact, alive and sentient, I decided to forgo smashing any more holes into the walls as well. Better to be safe than sorry, especially when maniacal, flesh-eating ghouls were the possible consequence. I mean, I didn't know for the fact that they were flesh-eating, but since the walls were literally low-grade digestive acid, I felt like that was a safe bet. For the next hour, I used the wallpaper parchment to sketch out a crude map as I wandered through the twists and turns, but eventually that failed too. I ran out of parchment space long before I ran out of corridors. This place was just too big to map with any degree of accuracy. The process did yield one unexpected result, however. With a bird's-eye view of the lobby, I realized there were some repeatable patterns and that things weren't quite as random as they seemed at first glance. The researcher had mentioned quadrants and sectors, and now I knew why. I was currently stranded inside of a giant, self-contained box, comprised of a series of smaller interconnected boxes. In essence, a grid. Most of the hallways and corridors were designed to drive traffic back toward the middle of the sector and into an area I'd deemed the lobby hub, which wasn't far from where I'd first woken up. There was one corridor, though, in one of the outlying sectors, that seemed to break the pattern. Instead of eventually looping back around toward the hub, it cut through the outer edge of the perimeter and went elsewhere. Likely to another quadrant, though it was impossible to say for sure. It took the better part of another hour to get back over to the hallway. Reading the map was tricky at best, but when I did, I immediately noticed one small, but important difference. Event. The hallway looked identical to the others, but near the bottom of the wall, just above the baseboard, was a beige air duct vent cover. It wasn't big enough to climb into, and even if it had been, there was no way I would have. Who knew what in the name of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph would be waiting for me inside? Probably a pulsating, demonic gullet, eager to turn me into meat slurry. Even though the vent shaft was small, I still managed to unscrew the plate cover and poke my head inside. The beam of my mug light illuminated a long metal duct that went straight as an arrow before eventually being swallowed up by the darkness. This was the first corridor I'd seen with no turns. No bends. No intersections. Not having any other leads or ideas, I opted to follow it. Plain, beige ventilation covers appeared every 15 minutes or so, always in the same place, low down on the wall, just above the white crown molding, and always identical to the last. I kept the slammer in my hand as I moved, compulsively checking the time. It was 2:17 a.m. Newfoundland Standard Time, and the super slammer of shielding had officially reset by the time I came to a door. This was different than the brown wooden double doors I'd happened across a few times before. It had a black plastic sign affixed to the front that read, "Bathroom, employees only." I didn't go in. Not right away. I was exhausted and thirsty, and finding a bathroom was an answer to my prayers. Assuming it wasn't out of order, there would be a sink inside, which meant water. I also knew I couldn't just keep working forever. I'd have to stop eventually. Unlike the creatures that call this place home, I was only human, and I'd need to sleep. So far, the thought of the pot-bellied lobby greeters had kept me moving steadily forward, but it wouldn't be hard to jam the door and barricade myself inside. It wasn't a perfect solution, but that had to be better than sleeping out in the open. Still, I hesitated. It was perfect. Too perfect. In my gut, it felt like a trap. The hallway, studded with ventilation covers, continued to the right. I could always keep following it in hopes that it would take me to another quadrant, and to a way out of the lobby. But, begrudgingly, I had to admit there was no guarantee that I would find a way out at all. Even if this hallway did connect to another quadrant, there was an equally good chance that the quadrant would be an endlessly frustrating maze, just like the area I was leaving behind. Taking a pit stop in the restroom was the best option. The only option, really. I slipped the slammer into my left palm, then pulled out my hammer. I took a few deep breaths to steady my fraying nerves, then awkwardly cranked the silver door lever down and kicked the door inward with a booted foot. The metal slab squawked and groaned as it opened, revealing a rectangular room with white-tiled floors and lime-green walls. The restroom looked like it had been plucked out of an '80s shopping mall. A rectangular ceiling fixture painted the room in harsh white light. Against the left wall was a sink situated below a small mirror with a large crack running up its face. Directly opposite the sink was a solitary toilet. An unholy stink emanated from it, but a black lid covered up whatever rectal carnage had been inflicted upon the poor porcelain bowl. Perched in the far corner of the room, for reasons I couldn't even begin to comprehend, was a padded red sitting chair with metal legs. The breath caught in my throat. Not far from the chair was a second door, set into the far wall. This one wasn't wood, but matte gray metal with the word stairwell, lobby exit spray painted across the front in blocky white letters. I'd just hit the jackpot. Except, I still couldn't shake the feeling that this was a trap. I glanced left and right, searching for any sign of the lobby greeters, but there was nothing. I was utterly alone. And the bathroom itself was relatively small with nowhere for a potential assailant to hide. The researcher had told me in no uncertain terms that if I wanted to survive, I needed to get to Howler's Hold on floor 7. I also had at least one item that I couldn't use until I descended and found a progenitor monolith. Sure, this could be a trap. Or it could be my only chance. Despite my mounting hesitation, I stepped into the bathroom, then pushed the door shut behind me with my heel, never taking my eyes off the exit to the stairwell. The bathroom door closed with an audible click, and I let out a soft sigh of relief when the whole room didn't go up in a fiery explosion. Had I really expected to find an IED wired to the bathroom door? No. At this point, though, there wasn't anything that would truly surprise me. I sidestepped over to the sink and wiggled the faucet handle. There was a rumble, followed by a gurgle, then a stream of brown water sputtered out, quickly turning clear. That was common enough for plumbing that had sat unused for a while. Even if the stairwell turned out to be a bust, finding a source of drinking water was a huge win. I killed the tap, and ominous silence filled the room once again. Gripping my hammer even more tightly, I padded across the tiled floor and tried the door. There was a metal push bar running across the front. I gave it a good, solid kick, but the door didn't budge. Locked. Because of course it was. Set into the metal push bar was a small, circular hole that would accommodate a key. I wasn't a locksmith by any stretch of the imagination, but I'd dealt with doors like these more times than I could count on commercial worksits. Jimmying them open could be tricky, but with a little patience and the Irwin 9" -1 multi-bit screwdriver in my belt, I figured I could get her done with a little patience and elbow grease. I turned, taking one last sweep of the room to ensure I was alone. Still nothing. Dropping to one knee, I set my hammer down on the tile floor and began to work at the lock with my screwdriver, prodding around inside the hole, searching for the release mechanism. I didn't hear the soft scrape of porcelain on tile until something heavy slammed into my side like an NFL linebacker and sent me tumbling away from the door.